Relative Values is a project that I've been developing with Leandro Vagliacci and the team at People's Palace Projects over the last few years, in which we've been thinking together about how can arts organisations count the value of their work? What is that relative value in terms of the way in which they provide health, well-being, security, employment? So we know that the arts are great at doing that sort of thing, but we're not always so good at finding ways to tell that story. Of course, we can use case studies. We can look at what happens to a particular participant or a group of participants during the work with that arts organisation and afterwards. But we wanted to try and find a way that we could produce evidence, or not so much that we could produce evidence, rather that arts organisations themselves could learn and acquire new tools to look at how their work has impact. And we wanted to look at something very specific. We wanted to look at the way in which arts organisations, theatres, local hip-hop groups, whatever, how they had an impact on territory, the area they were based on. So we set about creating the first Relative Values projects with Contact Theatre in Manchester, with Battersea Arts Centre in London, with the Centre of the Arts in the favela complex of Maré in Rio de Janeiro, and with another arts organisation in Rio de Janeiro that actually has lots of links back to Contact Theatre and Battersea Arts Centre, and that organisation is called the Agency of Youth Networks. So these 4 organisations worked with us over a year to try and devise a set of indicators, in other words, things that they would know, that they could count, that would give an idea of the impact of their work on territory, their impact of their work with young people in particular. And that work evolved. We found a way, I hope, of providing those organisations with a means by which they could estimate, judge, calibrate the value of their work. And what was really specific and important to us, that we could find a way that we could do that with numbers rather than just with telling stories. And these numbers are the sort of numbers that are the sort of data and evidence that economists, for example, could use and understand. They needed to be coherent, they needed to be consistent, and they needed to be comparable. And out of that year-long project, we produced a report, Relative Values 1, which shows that both the methodology but also the results that those organisations produced. We learned enough during that project to make some adaptations, and then we tried to think about how could you do that, not with so much big organisations like that, but what would you do if you were to work with micro producers in very vulnerable territories like the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, where often it's one person working or 2 people working in a really hyper-local context, but doing incredible work. How could they produce data about the work they were doing so that they could understand more, to get the value of their work, and I suppose to evaluate that work? So we worked with 40 young producers, all of them under 30, all of them people who are making work happen in the most difficult circumstances. They were selected by 2 of the organisations from Relative Values 1, the Centre of the Arts in Maré and the Agency for the Youth Networks, both in Rio de Janeiro, working in those sort of communities themselves. Each of them selected 20 young people, and those 20 young people worked out the indicators that they thought were important to judge their own work by. So we trained them in creating the indicators, in devising questionnaires and surveys, in applying those surveys with the people that had experience of their work, people who participated in their workshops, seen their shows, who'd engaged with them in some way during the previous 12 months. And they interviewed over 1,000 people that had participated in their work across the 40 organisations, or the 40 young producers. And again, we analysed that data and we produced a report, which is known as Relative Values 2. And then we had a commission from Itaú Bank, which is Brazil's largest bank, and they run a funding programme called Rumos, which sort of means towards. And that programme has been running for many years. And it's the largest open funding call in Brazil. And they fund about 110 organizations every 2 years. And they approached us because they'd heard about this methodology that we've been working on. And they asked if we could test it out with just 5 of those organizations from really different contexts in Brazil, from right up in the northern region close to the Amazon, right down to the south in Porto Alegre, to organizations in favelas in Rio, in Sao Paulo, and in Belo Horizonte, in the center of the country. And so we set about thinking about how we could adapt it to very different contexts and really different sorts of organizations. Some of them were theatre organizations that have been going for 20 years. Others were 2 photographers working with a group of people in a favela in Belo Horizonte. What would it feel like if you had the same methodologies for very different instances in which the arts happen? Normally, all of them working in quite vulnerable situations, but very different sort of ones, from favelas to poor rural communities to peripheral neighborhoods in large cities. And again, we did a report that came out of that project of those 5 organizations, and that was Relative Values 3. And we've, from the success of working with Itaú on their Humus program, we are now currently working on a new program, working with 20 organizations for the next funding call. And let's hope as the years go on, we carry on developing and learning with the arts organizations about what they want to measure, what do they want to count. We're just there to help them identify those features that are important to them, those indicators, and help them produce data that can be used in evidence about developing more effective cultural policy.